Forget the traditional power centers and the usual diplomatic theater. When the global energy order was thrown into absolute chaos recently, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, didn't book a frantic ticket to Washington, Riyadh, Moscow, or Beijing. Instead, on May 7, 2026, he flew straight to Ottawa for an urgent high-stakes sit-down with Mark Carney. Let me be perfectly clear about what we are witnessing. This was not some routine bilateral glad-handing session or a scheduled policy consultation between a member government and an international institution. This was an emergency scramble triggered by a brutal, ongoing geopolitical reality. Since March 4, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz, the vital maritime artery handling a staggering 20% of the world's daily oil supply, has been functionally locked down by Iranian military aggression. The world's most critical energy choke point is effectively dead in the water. I want you to understand the sheer magnitude of this disruption because the numbers are not abstract theories. Every single tanker captain looking to haul Persian Gulf crude to desperate Asian markets is now forced to price in the terrifying calculus of Iranian fast boats, sea mines, and anti-ship missiles. The crisis ignited on March 2, 2026, when an IRGC advisor named Ibrahim Jabari essentially drew a line in the sand. He declared the 33-kilometer-wide strait completely closed and openly threatened to incinerate any vessel attempting to transit. The fallout was a market earthquake, creating the most severe disruption to global energy supply since the infamous 1973 oil embargo. Brent crude violently smashed past the $120 per barrel mark. By March 12th, the Gulf's heavyweight producers had collectively hemorrhaged at least 10 million barrels per day in export capacity. Adding insult to injury, Iran's newly minted Persian Gulf Strait Authority is now extorting transit tolls in yuan from any vessel daring to seek passage. The liquefied natural gas market fared even worse. Following precision Iranian drone strikes on Ras Laffan on March 2nd, Qatar Energy was forced to declare a blanket force majeure on all its LNG exports. Think about the ripple effect. Qatar is the world's undisputed titan of LNG exports, and every molecule it sends to Asia must traverse Hormuz as a liquefied cargo. That vital gas, the fuel that keeps South Korean power plants humming, Japanese metropolitan grids online, and Indian industrial sectors alive, simply vanished overnight. By mid-March 2026, those Qatari LNG shipments still couldn't be delivered. Now, some optimistic analysts will point to the Gulf Cooperation Council's alternative pipelines as a potential safety net. They love to highlight Saudi Arabia's 200-kilometer east-west pipeline, which snakes to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, or the UAE's Abu Dhabi pipeline running to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. But let's look at the hard math, because geopolitics doesn't care about optimistic spin. Combined, those bypass routes max out at redirecting roughly 5 million barrels a day. In 2024, the daily flow through Hormuz was hitting 20 million barrels. Those pipelines cover barely 32% of the Gulf's output. That leaves a staggering 68% of crude with absolutely no alternative exit route, and for the LNG sector, there is zero bypass infrastructure to fall back on. Furthermore, the United States Navy, despite its unparalleled maritime superiority, cannot entirely neutralize this brand of asymmetric warfare. Fast attack boats swarm in minutes, mobile missile platforms evade sweeping detection, and submarines hide in the Gulf's shallow thermocline disrupted waters. The U.S. Navy can only manage the risk, which translates to a supply route kept open at an exorbitant cost denominated in massive insurance premiums, agonizing cargo delays, and intense commercial anxiety at the Larak Island traffic separation scheme. This systemic failure is exactly why the frantic question echoing through every energy ministry in Northeast Asia, where do we get oil and gas that isn't coming through Hormuz, is being decisively answered by Canada. The IEA director didn't fly to Ottawa for maple syrup. He went because the solution to the most acute energy security crisis of our lifetime runs straight through Alberta. Right now, Alberta is absolutely shattering every production record on its books. Back in December 2025, the province hit a new monthly high, pumping an unprecedented 4.4 million barrels per day. Looking at the broader picture, total Canadian crude and equivalents averaged 5.13 million barrels daily in 2024, and surged to an average of 5.19 million in the first half of 2025. Canada firmly stands as the fourth largest oil producer on the planet. The domestic heavyweights, Canadian Natural Resources, Cenovus, Suncor, and Imperial Oil, are aggressively targeting a combined 3.9 million barrels of oil equivalent per day in 2026, with Canadian Natural Resources alone gunning for a record 62 million. But pumping massive volumes of oil is only half the battle. Delivering it safely to desperate buyers is the real geopolitical prize. And this is where Canada's once maligned geography has morphed into its supreme strategic weapon. Every single barrel of that surging Alberta production can now flow effortlessly to the British Columbia coast via the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. This massive piece of infrastructure, which came online in May 2024, tripled the original pipeline's capacity to 890,000 barrels a day. From the Hardisty terminal in Alberta to the Westridge Marine Terminal in Vancouver, it loads tankers directly into the safe embrace of the Pacific Ocean. Cannot overstate how critical this specific routing is for the global supply chain. These ships sail northwest across the open North Pacific, entirely avoiding the Persian Gulf. They completely bypass the Strait of Malacca, the notorious bottleneck between Indonesia and Malaysia that historically handled 80% of China's Middle Eastern oil imports, a vulnerability Chinese military planners have long dreaded as their Malacca dilemma. They avoid the fraught geopolitical minefield of the South China Sea, where endless territorial disputes fester. They arrive in ports like Yokohama, Ulsan, Ningbo, and Zhoushan faster and more cost-effectively than any Middle Eastern or U.S. Gulf Coast alternative. Nobody is launching an Iranian drone at Fort McMurray, and no IRGC missile battery is locking onto a terminal in Vancouver. The Hormuz problem and the Malacca problem are simultaneously eradicated the moment the oil originates in Alberta. This profound structural shift is even more dramatic and permanent in the LNG sector. We are currently watching Asian utilities race to lock in ironclad 20 to 40-year contracts, securing a permanent structural insurance policy against Middle Eastern volatility. LNG Canada's Phase 1 facility in Kitimat, British Columbia, the country's first ever LNG export hub, has been pushing out 14 million metric tons annually straight into the North Pacific since its inaugural cargo in June 2025. It's no coincidence that the joint venture operating it includes Mitsubishi, Korea Gas Corporation, PetroChina, and Petronas. 4 out of the 5 partners are the exact Asian entities desperate to cure their dangerous addiction to Qatari gas. With a final investment decision for Phase 2 anticipated by late 2026 or early 2027, and Kasai Lissam's LNG fully cleared near Prince Rupert, the momentum is unstoppable. Factor in the advancing Cedar LNG and Woodfibre LNG projects, Canada's total Pacific export capacity is rocketing toward an excess of 40 million metric tons a year by the early 2030s. The United States, despite holding the crown as the world's largest LNG exporter, is practically useless in this specific Pacific crisis. Their export terminals are stranded on the Gulf or East Coast. For them to supply Japan, it requires a grueling, costly 24-day voyage squeezing through the Panama Canal. As a brilliant Fortune magazine analysis pointed out in March 2026, the logic is as simple as glancing at a map. Canada sits on the Pacific, right next to Asia. The U.S. Atlantic Gulf does not. The financial windfall from this geographical lottery is undeniable and compounding by the day. For decades, Alberta's landlocked crude was violently punished by the Western Canada Select Discount, a persistent financial penalty forced upon producers because their only buyers were American Midwestern refiners wielding absolute monopsony power. Not anymore. That historical discount began collapsing the moment Trans Mountain opened. The Canada Energy Regulator noted that the spread, which used to bleed producers for $15 to $30 a barrel, had shrunk to a mere $9.95 by June 2025. Now, with Brent hovering above $100 and a 20% global supply vacuum, desperate Asian buyers are throwing massive premiums at reliable Hormuz-free crude. That historical discount is rapidly morphing into a premium as supply security exacts its true price. It's exactly why Cenovus Energy flaunted a staggering 83% profit spike for Q1 2026, mirroring the massive jump reported by Canadian Natural Resources. Yet, this triumph isn't without its glaring internal contradictions. Cenovus CEO John McKenzie, alongside Canadian Natural Resources John McKenzie, have both starkly warned that Canada still risks strangling its own golden goose through regulatory sluggishness and carbon policy uncertainty. It is a miracle we even have this infrastructure. We cannot forget that the $20 $5 billion Trans Mountain expansion, the most expensive infrastructure project in Canadian history, only exists today because the federal government had to stage a $4.4 billion bailout in August 2018. Kinder Morgan was ready to walk away entirely, suffocated by British Columbia's political opposition and an endless environmental review process. The infrastructure that is single-handedly saving global energy security was almost killed in its crib. But the success is infectious. Even the long-stalled Northern Gateway pipeline to Prince Rupert has been miraculously resurrected from regulatory purgatory. Multilateral institutions now view Canada not just as a regional player, but as the foundational bedrock of global energy security architecture. Ambassador Jonathan Wilkinson is actively negotiating Canada's newly elevated energy role at the highest diplomatic levels in Europe. The international energy establishment isn't trying to manage Canada anymore. They are aggressively courting it. The grand geopolitical irony of this moment is truly something to behold. Donald Trump spent 14 exhausting months trying to strong-arm Canada into absolute energy subservience, casually wielding threats of 100% tariffs and treating American market dominance as a lethal leverage point. But while American constitutional lawyers and courts tied themselves in knots debating the legality of his emergency statutes, Canadian tankers were already quietly, steadily loading at Westridge and sailing across the Pacific. Iran's IRGC, by blockading the Strait of Hormuz, accidentally did more to justify the Trans Mountain expansion and LNG Canada in a single month than decades of domestic political maneuvering ever achieved. It all circles back to a profound truth laid out by Warren Buffett. He observed that amateur investors look at supply chains and merely see logistics, but the true masters look at a map and see geography. They understand the vital difference between what is substitutable and what is inherently irreplaceable. On paper, analysts might claim the Strait of Hormuz can be substituted. In harsh practice, the massive volumes and decades-long infrastructure timelines make it impossible. But Canada spent years and tens of billions of dollars building the exact geographical cure Asia desperately needed. When the crisis finally detonated, the medicine was already sitting on the shelf, the tankers were loading, and the contracts were ready. A nation that spent 60 years handicapped by its landlocked map has emerged as the undisputed, untouchable anchor of the global energy trade. Geopolitics is a ruthless game of leverage, but ultimately, geography is the one hand you cannot fold, build, or tariff. It simply is, and right now it undeniably belongs to Canada.